Welcome back all of you to another lecture on literary theory. Today we are going to continue with our discussion on structuralism. Now, as you will remember, in our previous lecture, which was on Ferdinand de Saussure, the linguist, we had looked at how his interpretation of how language works plays a fundamental role in formulating the theory of structuralism. However, we had also noted in our previous meeting that Saussure's work is almost entirely a commentary on how language works, and by itself it does not become apparent how that work on language can be used to understand and theorize literary narratives. So, for this we will have to look at the work of theorists who utilize Saussure's structuralist argument to construct a framework of literary theory. And in today's lecture, we are going to do just that by focusing on the writings of a person called Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, here it is important to note that Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was Belgium born French intellectual, was actually not a literary critic. In fact, he was an anthropologist by profession. He was born in 1908 and he died in 2009. So, he lived a long life, and during this long life, which in fact spanned over more than a century, he taught both in France as well as in America. And indeed, it was in America that Lévi-Strauss met Roman Jakobson. You will remember Roman Jakobson from our earlier lectures on formalism. So, it is in America that Lévi-Strauss met Roman Jakobson, and Jakobson deeply influenced his way of thinking, and it was Jakobson's influence which made Lévi-Strauss turn towards structuralism and allowed him to explore structuralism as a tool for analyzing human society. And indeed, both Jakobson and Lévi-Strauss had fled the continental Europe at the wake of the Second World War. So, they shared similar kind of history, and America proved for these intellectuals a safe haven, just like it proved to so many persecuted intellectuals during the second half of the 20th century. Which is why, if you note, the America of the mid 20th century proved to be a wonderful melting pot of ideas and an intellectual powerhouse. So, a number of intellectuals that you will be encountering in this course actually drifted to America from continental Europe during the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, so with the end of the Second World War, Lévi-Strauss was back in France, and he became a celebrity anthropologist in France, especially after his publication of his memoir titled Tristes Tropiques, which documented, among other things, his travels in the Amazonian rainforest and his ethnographic study of the native tribes in Amazonian rainforest. So, that was a very important piece of work that he did, and it became known to the wider public through his memoir Tristes Tropiques. Though academic work based on that research was already known within the limited circle of anthropologists. Anyway, in spite of being an anthropologist, primarily an anthropologist, Lévi-Strauss is a significant figure for us. He is important from our perspective as students of literary theory because of two reasons. And the first reason is that he expanded the insights of Ferdinand de Saussure on language and gave it a wider sociocultural relevance. So, this is the first reason. And the second reason is that he used Saussure's insights to produce structuralist analysis of myths, and these structuralist analysis of myths remain classic examples of how structuralist principles can be applied to decode narrative structures, which, as you will understand, is deeply significant for any student of literature. And indeed, in today's lecture, we are going to discuss one such classic examples of his analysis of myth by taking up his study of the Oedipus myth. So, one of the most interesting and far-reaching arguments that Levi-Strauss forwarded was that the socio-cultural existence of human being is underlined and supported by a deep-seated grammar. And here Levi-Strauss was borrowing from Saussure's distinction between langue and parole. So, as discussed in our previous lecture, Saussure had argued that our concrete language uses are underlined by a set of rules and regulations, just like the sequence of moves in a particular game of chess is underlined by a set of rules that are above and beyond the individual moves made by a particular player at any given point in time. So, Saussure identified the underlying set of rules guiding a particular language structure as langue, and the concrete language uses guided by that structure as parole. Now, according to Levi-Strauss, this langue and parole distinction can be extended beyond language to encompass human socio-cultural existence in general. And all major aspects of human socio-cultural life, according to Levi-Strauss, are guided by underlying sets of regulations, which structure human experience, just like a langue within a language structures paroles. So, Levi-Strauss exemplifies this by showing how, for instance, the kinship structure that locates us within our society are guided by a set of regulations that might be identified as a kind of underlying social grammar. And this was a very important piece of argument that Levi-Strauss forwarded. But this kinship structure aside, Levi-Strauss is also known for his analysis of myths, and those analyses are really very important as far as we are concerned as students of literature, because according to Levi-Strauss, myths are the language which helps humans, or at least those that he identifies as primitive men, to articulate various aspects of his existence, and myths provide him with this possibility of articulating the various aspects of his existence, and by providing him with this possibility helps him negotiate his being in the world better. In other words, myths are a kind of language use. Myths are paroles, which are like language underlined by a set of rules, a set of grammar, a kind of deep seated langue. So, as I said, in other words, the underlying grammar that informs the myths also structures the worldview of human beings and the ways in which the human beings conceptualize their position and their role within their surrounding environment. And this is very beautifully put by the scholar Terence Hawkes, who, while writing on Saussure and his analysis of the use of myths by primitive men, states, and I quote, "Levi-Strauss's concern is ultimately with the extent to which the structures of myths prove actually formative as well as reflective of men's minds." And so, his aim, he says, is not to show how men think in myths, but how myths think in men unbeknown to them. By the way, this book that I have just quoted from, which is Terence Hawkes's Structuralism and Semiotics is a wonderfully well written and concise account of the structuralist theory, and I would highly recommend this book to any one of you who want to understand structuralism in more details. So, coming back to the topic of our discussion, the way myths structure the human worldview, structure the human mind, cannot be understood by merely listening to individual narrations of particular myths, because they are what Saussure would call paroles. To understand the structuring aspect of myths, we will need to go to the deeper level of rules which govern these individual narratives, or in other words, to the mythic langue, to use Saussure's language. And Levi-Strauss shows us the way to approach this level of deep grammar by his analysis of the Oedipus myth in his essay, The Structural Study of Myth. It is a very important essay by Levi-Strauss. So, to explore Levi-Strauss's structural study, we need to begin with a telling of the myth, and in this case it will be my individual version among the many versions available. So, this telling of the myth that I am going to perform right now would be a kind of a parole. So, but like paroles, the distinction shared by these individual narrations, among which my narration would be one particular one, are hardly significant here, because our effort is to go down to the level of langue which is common to all these versions. But nevertheless, one particular version needs to be put on the table, so that we are all familiar with what we are talking about, and those of you who are already familiar with the Oedipus myth, kindly bear with me for a few minutes as I present the narrative, and I would do so not only because it will help us understand Levi-Strauss's structuralist intervention or interpretation of that myth, but would also help us later when we study Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, because Sigmund Freud also makes extensive use of this Oedipus myth to come up with this theory of Oedipal complex. So, now the story. The myth starts with a person called Cadmos, whose sister Europa was abducted by the god Zeus. Now, distraught over the loss of his sister Europa, his father actually instructed Cadmos and all his other siblings to go out in search of Europa. So, the whole family therefore scattered to different places, and all of them were looking for Europa, but none of the brothers, including Cadmos, could find Europa. And incidentally, when Cadmos, during his own search for Europa, reached a place called Delphi, he was told by the oracle there. Delphi in ancient Greece was a famous seat of an oracle. He was told by the oracle in Delphi that the search for Europa is futile, you stop looking for her, you will never find her, but instead what you do is you found a new city, because that will be something fruitful. So, Cadmos, heeding to this advice, sent his men to bring some pure water, so that he could perform a ritual of sacrificing a cow to goddess Athena and start building the new city. Now, his men went out in search of pure water, but they were, however, killed by a dragon. And when his men did not return after a very long time, Cadmos himself went in search of them, and he subsequently encountered the dragon, confronted it and killed it. And following the suggestion of the goddess Athena, Cadmos then took out the teeth of the dragon and planted them, sowed them on the ground. And as a consequence of this planting of the dragon's teeth in the ground, a number of warriors came up from the ground who were known as the Spartoi, and they started battling with each other. And after much fighting, only 5 of the Spartoi were left, and they subjected themselves, they accepted allegiance to Cadmos, and Cadmos with their help founded the city of Thebes. So, this is the first part of the myth, but it then goes on, because it is in the family of Cadmos that Oedipus is born, the hero of our myth. Oedipus's grandfather, whose name was Labdakos, was one of the grandsons of Cadmos, and the name Labdakos signifies lame, L-A-M-E, one who has difficulty in walking. And Labdakos's son was named Laios, and the meaning of the name Laios, if you translate it exactly, it means in Greek left sided, right. And as we shall see, these meanings of the proper names will be very significant in Levi-Strauss's analysis of the myth. Now, Laios married a woman called Jocasta, and in due course Laios became the king of Thebes. Now, King Laios was, however, warned by an oracle that his own son would kill him, and to save himself from this fate, he pinned together the feet of his newborn son and asked a shepherd to kill the baby by exposing it to the elements outside the city, by exposing it to rain and sun, so that the baby will die. Now, the shepherd who took the baby from the king did not kill it, but rather he gave the baby to a friend who adopted the child as his own son and who gave him the name of Oedipus. And again, this particular proper name has a very significant meaning, significant as far as Levi-Strauss's analysis is concerned, because Oedipus means someone with a swollen foot. Anyway, when Oedipus was a young man, he learnt from the oracle of Delphi that he would kill his own father and he would marry his own mother. Now, of course, he was very shocked by this oracle, and horrified, he fled away from his home, from the home of his adoptive parents, whom he believed to be his biological father and mother, and he ran away to Thebes. Now, while on his way, he ran into a chariot which was being driven by Laios himself, and of course, Oedipus did not know Laios, and Laios did not know who Oedipus was. And they had an altercation which led to Oedipus killing Laios. Now, after killing Laios, when Oedipus finally arrived at Thebes, he saw that a sphinx was killing the inhabitants of the city by asking them different kinds of riddles, and when they failed to answer those riddles, the sphinx would kill them. Now, Oedipus answered the riddles and he got rid of the sphinx and became the savior of Thebes, and as the savior of Thebes, he was made its king, and as the king of Thebes, he subsequently married the existing queen, who was Jocasta, who, you would remember, was Oedipus's own mother. Now, of course, Oedipus did not know any of this, but it was later revealed to him, and this fact that he had killed his own father and he had married his own mother led to his being expelled from the city of Thebes, and his place on the throne was taken up by the two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and they were the son of Oedipus and Jocasta. Now, the two brothers, after Oedipus was removed from the throne, the two brothers fell apart, and during a war, Eteocles killed Polynices. But after the death of Polynices, it was decreed by the king of Thebes that Polynices' body would not be buried, and anyone who would bury him, who would perform the rituals and who would properly bury Polynices, would himself or herself be buried alive. So, that was a royal decree. However, despite this injunction, Polynices' sister Antigone buried the body of his brother and then later committed suicide herself to escape the fact of being buried alive. Now, the way Levi-Strauss analyzes this mythic narrative or parole is to first segregate it to the level of methemes, what he calls methemes. So, what are methemes? Methemes are the constituent units of a myth, and as far as the mythic structure is concerned, they are equivalents of the word sounds, which when we were studying a language structure, we identified word sounds as the constituent unit. So, just like word sounds are constituent units of a language structure, metheme is the constituent unit of a myth. So, what Levi-Strauss does is he first reduces the Oedipus myth to the level of individual methemes, which are its constituent building blocks, and he then arranges them in a unique pattern of rows and columns. And you can see this unique pattern of rows and columns that Levi-Strauss constructs out of the methemes of the Oedipus myth in the slide now. So, let us try and understand this slide. First of all, as you can see, all the units that are listed in this chart are actually individual methemes. So, for instance, Cadmos seeking his sister Europa is one metheme, Cadmos killing the dragon is another metheme, the Spartoi killing one another is another metheme, and so on and so forth. So, each unit that you see in front of you represents one metheme. Now, Levi-Strauss says that if you read the methemes horizontally by disregarding their division in columns, you will get the narration of the myth. You will get something like what I just did, the parole, the narration of the myth. However, in order to understand the structuring of this myth, you will need to read it vertically and pay attention to the columns instead of reading it horizontally. Indeed, if you do that, you will see that the first two columns in the left are in an oppositional relationship to each other, and similarly the last two columns in the right are in an oppositional relationship with each other as well. We will come to the specificities of these oppositional relationships in a moment, but what I would like to point out here is that this is the typical way in which a structuralist critic would engage with a narrative. So, she would first segregate the narrative into its constituent blocks, and then she would try to figure out the oppositional relationships that exist between them to find out the grammar of relationship that structures these constituent parts. So, typically a structuralist criticism would produce such neat rows of binary opposites for their analysis, as you can see in this slide. But now, let us come back to Levi-Strauss's chart again, and if you focus on the two leftmost columns, column 1 and column 2, you will see that they have something or the other to do with family. But whereas in column 1 we see an overrating of family relations, in column 2 we see its exact opposite, which is an underrating of family relations. But then what do I mean by overrating and underrating? So, if you see the methemes arranged in column 1, you will see that all of them speak about excessively intimate blood relationships. And this is, for instance, expressed in the excessive grief that Cadmos and his family feels for Europa. It is expressed in the incestuous relationship between Oedipus and his mother, which is again an excessively deep relationship. Or for instance, it is expressed by Antigone's decision to risk her own life to bury her brother. Now, this is what Levi-Strauss calls the overrating of blood relations, which ties the methemes of column 1 into a single bundle. They make it a single category. Column 2 presents the binary opposite to this. So, the Spartoi killing each other, Oedipus killing his father, Eteocles killing his brother are all expressions of what Levi-Strauss calls the underrating of blood relations. Now, let us come to the binary opposition between column 3 and column 4, which will require some explanation. Now, column 3 refers to two monsters, the first being the dragon and the other being a sphinx. Now, both of them are described by Levi-Strauss as Chthonian creatures, which means that they are regarded as creatures who are born out of the earth. Now, in the third column, these creatures are all killed, which signifies a denial of their chthonic existence. Column 4, on the other hand, obeying the logic of structuralism and its rule of binary opposition, upholds the notion of chthonic origin and chthonic existence. Now, this upholding of the chthonic origin is gathered from the fact that all the characters mentioned in the fourth column, be it Labdakos for instance, or Laios or Oedipus, all of them have defective feet or have some problem in walking. Now, this, according to Levi-Strauss, is the typical character that various myths across the world associates with creatures who are born out of the earth, chthonic creatures. So, we have now in front of us two sets of binary relations. The first relation, represented by column 1 and column 2, presents the binary of overrating of blood relations versus underrating of blood relations, and the second opposition is represented by column 3 and column 4, which presents the denial of chthonic existence and the assertion of chthonic existence. And if we place these two sets of oppositional relationships side by side, they would look something like this, as you can see on the slide, where on the one side we have overrating of blood relations and beneath it underrating of blood relations, and then on the other side we have denial of chthonic existence and below it assertion of the chthonic existence. So, this then reduces the mythic narrative in a neat set of structural opposition, but it does not produce any obvious explanation as of yet about how this underlying mythic structure provides human beings with a tool to negotiate his or her sense of being in the world, or how does it structure his or her worldview. To connect this structural opposition underlying the Oedipus myth with a larger sociocultural content, Levi-Strauss argues that this underlying language of the Oedipus myth actually provides a tool to the primitive human being through which he articulates the conflicting notions of his origin. So, according to Levi-Strauss, the society which produced this myth and was in turn structured by this myth was torn between two notions of human origin. How did human being came into being? The first notion was that human beings were autochthonous, which means that they had originally sprung out of the earth, they were born out of the earth. The second notion of human origin was in fact validated by their quotidian existence, quotidian experience of life, which was that human beings originated from sexual union between male and female within the social structure of a family. So, this was validated by their quotidian experience. Now, the deep structural grammar underlying the Oedipus myth does not actually help us to solve this conflict between the two notions of human origin. What it does, it gives us a language through which to coherently articulate this opposition and place them side by side for a better understanding. So, in Levi-Strauss's own words, the myth, and he is talking about the Oedipus myth here, has to do with the inability for a culture which holds the belief that mankind is autochthonous to find a satisfactory transition between this theory and the knowledge that human beings are actually born from the union of man and woman. Although the problem obviously cannot be solved, the Oedipus myth provides a kind of logical tool which relates the original problem, born from one or born from two, that is the original problem, to the derivative problem, born from different, which means born out of the sexual union of male and female who are different, or born from the same, which means born from the same earth. So, if you follow this logic, then the first two columns of Levi-Strauss's chart gets translated as follows. Since column 1 speaks of overrating of blood relations and the upholding of the family structure, it can be taken to signify an assertion of the notion of human origin through sexual union. On the contrary, column 2, since it speaks of underrating of blood relations and the family structure, can be taken to mean a denial of the notion of human origin through sexual union. Similarly, we can also translate the remaining two columns. Column 3, which speaks of a denial of existence of the chthonic creatures, can be taken to signify a denial of the notion of human beings' autochthonous origin, whereas column 4, which upholds the chthonic existence, can be taken to signify an assertion of human beings' autochthonous origin. Thus, the two sets of opposition can be written as this, where on the one side you have assertion of birth through sexual union, and below it the denial of birth through sexual union. Both of them form binary unit, and this equals on the other side denial of autochthonous origin of human being, and the opposition to this is provided by assertion of autochthonous origin. And look at the equal sign that I have put between them, because the assertion of birth through sexual union equals on the other side denial of autochthonous origin, whereas if you look at the sections below, you will see that the denial of birth through sexual union equals the assertion of autochthonous origin. So, for Levi-Strauss, this is ultimately what the Oedipus myth means at a deeper level. This is the lung of the Oedipus myth, Oedipus narrative, and irrespective of any individual kind of paroles, it is the structural grammar that is presented by this lung which guides the Oedipus narrative. So, whether you tell it, whether I tell it, whether someone else tells it, and there will be variations, individual variations of these paroles, but it will be this same lung that will guide all, that will structure all of these paroles. So, as you can see here, the structuralist analysis of narratives depend on identifying the underlying structural principle, the structuring principle rather, that informs any narrative, be it mythic narrative like the Oedipus myth, or say for instance an 18th century British poem or a contemporary Indian novel. This is the way we can approach structurally any narrative, and we will see how this structuralist theory of reading and understanding texts gets worked upon by someone called Roland Barthes, and we will take up Roland Barthes in our next lecture. Thank you.